Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. As we always state, if you're staying for the class, we know it is from the sunnah of our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, sit close together. So if you're sitting by the walls for a reason, that's fine. But otherwise, please do come forward and sit closer together so we can share in the blessings of this gathering properly, inshallah. So this is the first of a series of talks dealing with Usul Al-Fiqh, or the principles of deriving Islamic law or jurisprudence. And I warn you in advance, it is going to be a technical discussion. There's no way we can discuss Usul Al-Fiqh without going into technicalities. And some of the topics we'll be discussing will be very technical, like qiyas or analogy, for example, inshallah. So this isn't one thing we have to understand. Usul Al-Fiqh is that it's not a lecture or a series of talks on the rulings of things. So you won't find in this talk the fact that salah is wājib or fasting is wājib. That's not what we're talking about. So when we say the statement salah is wājib, for example, or salah is fard, the prayer is obligatory, Usul Al-Fiqh isn't concerned with the first half of the statement. It doesn't care about the act. What it cares about is the second half of the statement, is wājib. So Usul Al-Fiqh, what it does is it asks a question. When you say it's wājib, what do you mean? What do you mean by wājib? What is the essence of wājib? What was the process we followed to come to the conclusion that something is wājib, that's obligatory? What was the source material we used? What was the data we used to come to that conclusion, to help us come to that conclusion? So when we say salah is wājib, we're not concerned here with the first half of that statement. We don't care about the act. We're not here talking about what the rulings of actions are. We're concerned with the second half of the statement. What is the essence? What's the meaning of wājib? What's the process I used to come to that conclusion? What's the data I used, the source material I used to help me come to that conclusion? Likewise, when I say fasting for 3 days, the mid 3 days of every month, the ayyam al-bid, the mustahab is recommended. Again, Usul Al-Fiqh is not concerned with the first half of that statement. It doesn't care about the 3 days fast. It cares about the mustahab statement. What does mustahab mean? What does recommended really mean? How do we come to that conclusion that's recommended? What's the source material that we use to come to that conclusion? And even more fundamental than this, Usul Al-Fiqh is talking about, when we say the ḥukm for a particular act, the ruling for a particular act is whatever, what is in fact a ḥukm? What is the reality of the ruling? There are many, many people in the world today giving rulings. There are many, many authorities in the world today giving rulings and passing judgments. But when we're saying the ḥukm of something in Usul Al-Fiqh, what does it actually mean? What does a ruling mean that we are concerned with in Usul Al-Fiqh? So basically, Usul Al-Fiqh, or jurisprudence, or the principles of law, it deals with the tools and the sources used to extract law. It deals with the tools, the processes that you use, and the sources you go to in order for you to extract law. And this is what's stated in a poem, a famous poem on Usul Al-Fiqh. It's called Maraqi al-Saud. It goes, Al-ahkam wal-adillatu mawdu'u wa kawnuhu hadhi faqat masmu'u. That some people said that rules and sources are the evidence, is the material of Usul Al-Fiqh, or the topic of Usul Al-Fiqh. But in reality, it's just the sources. Sources is what Usul Al-Fiqh is talking about. What is the source? So we have what we call Usul Al-Fiqh, the principles of law. We apply these principles upon a body of material which we'll talk about. And then from the body of material we end up with something. And that something is fiqh, law. The halal and the haram, the do's and don'ts of Islam. So we take an Usul Al-Fiqh, what we're studying today, we're applying it to the source material, which we'll talk about in a bit, inshallah. And once we apply it to the source material, we end up with rules and regulations, which is called fiqh, law. And once we've come up with this whole corpus of law, this body of law, the scholars of Islam in the past, what they did was they gathered it all together and they did, if you like, a sort of trend analysis on the law, on the fiqh. And from that trend analysis, they came up with something else, which is often confused with Usul Al-Fiqh. And that is called Qawā'iḍ Al-Fiqh, or Fiqh maxims, maxims of fiqh. And this is something very different to Usul Al-Fiqh. Usul Al-Fiqh is what's used to derive the law. And then from the law, you do a trend analysis, and you find that there's certain things that are common in all the areas of fiqh in Islamic law. So in tahara, in purification, in salah, in fasting, in hajj, in trade, in business, whatever, you find there are certain trends that are common in all of them. So they extracted these trends out, and they call them fiqh maxims, or principles of fiqh as well, or maxims of fiqh. And so, for example, we have a famous poem by Abu Bakr al-Ahdal, where he talks about the 5 fundamental fiqh maxims that are used by jurists to extract law, or to help them extract law as well. And he goes, Al-fiqhu mabniyun ala qawā'iди, khamsin hiya al-umūru bil-maqāsidi. So he said the first one, fiqh is built upon 5 maxims, 5 fundamental maxims. The first is, actions are by intentions. Actions are by intentions. And what they mean by this is that when you look at all of Islamic law, all of Islamic jurisprudence, or Islamic law rather, you find that in every chapter, in every area in fiqh, this plays an important role. Your intention. What is your intention? We know the famous hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. That every single act is by the intention, and every single person will have what he intended. So whoever performed hijrah, and he performed it for the sake of Allah and His Messenger, then his migration, his hijrah is for Allah and His Messenger. But whoever performed migration for the sake of the world, to gain something from the world, or to gain a woman to marry, then his hijrah is for what he married, or what he migrated for. فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. So here the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he gave us an act, 2 people doing an act. Outwardly the act is exactly the same, both are making hijrah. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the act is totally different. Because why? The intentions of these 2 people are totally different. One person migrated for the sake of Allah and His Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam. Another person migrated for the dunya, he wanted to get better wealth, but more money, a better home or whatever. Or he found a woman he fell in love with, he migrated for the sake to that woman, to marry that woman. 2 acts outwardly look very similar, inwardly with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're totally different. Al-umūru bil-maqāsidi. وَبَعْدَهَا الْيَقِينُ لَا يَزَالُ بِالشَّكِّ فَاسْتَمِعْ لِمَا يُقَالُ. Another principle, maxim, that they derive. Certainty can't be removed by doubt. You can't remove a state of certainty because you're doubtful about something. The famous hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that if you're in prayer and you have some discomfort in your stomach and you're not sure whether you broke your wudu or not, don't leave the masjid, don't leave the prayer until you hear something or you smell something. Why? Because you're in a state of certainty that you're in a state of wudu. And then you have a doubt that comes across, you come across a doubt. Have I broken my wudu or not? The Messenger of Allah said, ignore the doubt, keep to the certainty. Unless you have another certain fact that overrides the first certainty. That certain fact being, you hear something or you smell something. وَبَعْدَهَا الْيَقِينُ لَا يَزَالُ بِالشَّكِّ فَاسْتَمِعْ لِمَا يُقَالُ. That certainty cannot be removed by doubt. وَتَجْلِبُ الْمَشَقَّةُ التَّيْسِيرًا ثَالِثُهَا فَكُنْ بِهَا خَبِيرًا. The third principle, that difficulty leads to ease. Difficulty leads to ease. We find in the Sharia that wherever things get difficult for a person, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His mercy gives us ease. He gives us the rules and regulations that give us an easy way out. So for example, it's permissible for a person who's about to die to eat haram food. It's permissible for somebody who is ill to break his fast because it's too difficult for him to fast. It's permissible for somebody who is pregnant and fasting if it's too difficult for her to fast, to break the fast. If somebody's on a journey and it's too difficult for them to fast, again, it's permissible to break the fast. If you're coerced to do something haram, if you're forced to do something haram, Allah overlooks that. If you make a genuine mistake, Allah overlooks the mistakes that are genuinely made by this Muslim Ummah. All of these, because if Allah was to judge us for our mistakes, it becomes too difficult for us. We're human beings. Our nature is to make mistakes. So wherever we find difficulty, wherever we find a situation of difficulty, we will always find Allah has given us a way out of that difficulty, that makes it easier for us to fulfill that same act of worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. That Allah wants ease from you. Allah wants ease of you. He wants to make things easy for you. He doesn't want to make things difficult for you. And our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, يَسِّرُوا وَلَا تُعَسِّرُوا. Make things easy for people. Don't make things difficult for people. Make things easy for people. Don't make things difficult for people. رَابِعُهَا فِيمَا يُقَالُ الضَّرَرُ يَزَالُ قَوْلًا لَيْسَ فِيهِ غَرَرُ. The fourth principle, harm is to be removed. Darar is to be removed. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, لَا ضَرَرَ وَلَا دِرَارَ. There's no harming, there's no causing of harm, there's no reciprocating of harm. There's no returning harm with harm. So you find over and over again in every area of Islamic law, any means of harming something else, be it a human being or a creature or an inanimate object, you find Islam is saying it's not allowed. Harming your neighbor, relations with a neighbor, relations with other people, trading with other people. It's haram to trade faulty goods, for example. Oppressing people, wrongdoing people. Over and over again we find harm is to be removed. Any form of harm is to be removed. Don't urinate in places where people pass. Don't put obstacles in places where people pass. Don't don't urinate underneath trees, for example, where people would sit. Don't do anything that would harm other people, be it a small harm or a great harm. خامسها العادة المحكمة فهذه الخمس جميعا محكمة. And the fifth maxim, fifth major maxim, customs and habits have a role to play in Islam. Islam doesn't get rid of the customs and the habits of different nations, different peoples, different tribes, different nationalities. All it says is that where these customs and these traditions contradict Islamic law, those customs and traditions are not allowed. Anything else is allowed. Marriage, for example. Islamic law is very simple about marriage. You have contracts, you have witnesses. Once that's signed, Islamic law doesn't tell you how to celebrate your marriage. Different people, different nationalities, different nations celebrate their marriage in different ways. Islam is fine with this. It's not come to cancel out traditions. Keep the traditions so long as they don't contradict Islam. So custom has a role to play in Islam. For example, an example of custom that we talk about outside of marriage. If a person does a job for somebody else, he does a plumbing job for somebody else, but they don't agree beforehand what the price is to be. After the job has been done, you look to the custom of the people. What is the price for that job in the market? What's the market rate for that job? And you pay him according to that market rate. That market rate will vary from nation to nation, people to people. But the custom here is it has a role to play here. All of these five are maxims of fiqh. They're not Usul Al-Fiqh. They're not Usul Al-Fiqh. They're not principles of fiqh. They're maxims. They're what you get from the other end of this process of Usul Al-Fiqh. And the scholars use both to derive rules and regulations. They use both to derive rules and regulations. They use the principles of fiqh and these maxims, the Qawā'iդ al-Fiqh, and both of them come together for new scenarios, and the scholars will use them to apply rules and regulations.
Can we ask?
Yeah, go on.
How does maqasid al-Sharia fit in?
So maqasid al-Sharia, if you like, the higher goals of Islamic law. What are the fundamental goals that Islamic law wants out of us, or from the law? What's the actual goal that Islam wants from the laws that it's given to mankind, so legislated for mankind? So, for example, they would say that the maqasid al-Sharia is there to preserve your religion. The goal, if you look at all of the laws of Islam, the higher goal of all of these laws, preserve your religion, preserve your intellect, preserve your sanity, preserve your life, preserve your honor, preserve your lineage, preserve your lineage. Okay? So these are, if you like, the maqasid of the Sharia, the higher goals, i.e. the actual goal behind the law, the legislation of Islam. What role do they have to play in Usul Al-Fiqh, or in terms of deriving regulations? They're not actually used to derive rules and regulations. What they're used to do is to make sure that the rule that's come out the other end it's like a check and measure. It's like a check, and to check that that rule is actually in accordance to the maqasid of the Sharia. So if the mujtahid comes up with a ruling, for example, and we find that that ruling actually is harmful for a person's life, then we say you made a mistake in your process somewhere, because it goes against the maqasid of the Sharia. You made a mistake somewhere. If a scholar makes a ruling and it goes against, it goes against a person's lineage, it goes against a person's honor, again we say to the mujtahid, you made a mistake somewhere, go back and look again. Because you're going against the fundamental goals of Islam in this ruling that you made. So there's a check and measure.
The question I was asking, Usul Al-Fiqh, Qawāʿid Al-Fiqh, they go underneath maqasid al-Sharia, or maqasid al-Sharia is above them. Which one is you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that I don't think it's correct to say, I mean, people do argue about whether they go before or above. I don't think it's correct to say that they go below or above because it's completely separate. Yeah. Qawāʿid and Uṣūl are used to derive rules, and maqasid is there to check that the rules are okay. Is that clear?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So when we talk about applying rules and regulations upon sources, what are the sources we are talking about? And the sources are, as I'm sure many of us, all of us know straight away, the Quran, the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we will discuss what the Quran is and how to derive rules and regulations from the Quran. And the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is the second source, the Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which has come to us today through the body of Hadith material. The third source is Arabic language. We cannot understand the book and the Sunnah, and we definitely cannot derive rules and regulations from them without first having a very, very deep grasp of the Arabic language. Sorry? So that's the third source, Arabic language. And the fourth source is aql, or Russian, or logic. And we'll find that actually in Usul Al-Fiqh there's a lot of logic. When we talk about logic, we're talking about that logic that can't be faulted. Yeah, basic fundamental logic. A part of the whole is smaller than the whole, for example. Basic logic. So logic is the fourth source of Islamic law, or jurisprudence rather. So we have four sources. Which are, what are they? You can repeat them to us?
Quran, Sunnah, Arabic language, and logic.
Yeah, Quran, Sunnah, Arabic language, and logic. Usul Al-Fiqh, historically speaking, as the poem Al-Maraqi Al-Saudi says, أول من ألفه في الكتب محمد بن شافع المطلب وغيره كان له سريقة مثل الذي للعرب من خليقة. That the first person to codify Islamic law, i.e. to write it down, was Imam Shafi'i, who died in 204 after Hijrah. And he says that before this, it wasn't that Usul Al-Fiqh was unknown before this. It's just the fact that scholars taught Usul Al-Fiqh, and the Sahaba before him knew Usul Al-Fiqh. And when you look at some of the statements of the Sahaba, it's clear that they understand it. They're talking about mutlaq and muqayyid and stuff. We'll talk about these things later on. They're talking about qiyas, analogy, and how to apply analogy. Again, we'll talk about that later on. But before Imam Shafi'i, it was never codified. Scholars may have taught it to each other, to their students. The Sahaba generally understood it from the teaching of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but it had never been codified. Imam Shafi'i rahmatullah alayhi was the first to codify it, and after him many scholars actually codified it, formally wrote it down. And we find, historically speaking, there are two different paths the scholars took when trying to codify Usul Al-Fiqh. Two very different paths. The first was a path of the mutakallimin. This is a statement, a label given to this type of scholar, mutakallimin. Now, mutakallimin, when we talk about theology, is a very negative term. It refers to philosophy, and especially Greek philosophy. But when we talk in Usul Al-Fiqh, it's actually the exact opposite. It's actually a very praiseworthy term. So terms can have different connotations in different sciences. In theology, mutakallimin is very negative. In Usul Al-Fiqh is very positive. And the mutakallimin approach is this. They said, let's go to the sources and derive our principles. So look to the sources, derive our principles. Once we've derived the principles, we apply those principles to extract law. So we've got the principles, we apply the principles, we extract law. This is the way of the mutakallimin. And historically speaking, this is represented by the three madhabs, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali madhabs. Okay, this is a scientific approach, if you like, of deriving, extracting regulations. And the mutakallimin, they paid very little attention, or some attention, but not a great deal of attention, to the fiqh that was already existing before them, i.e. of the Sahaba, or the Imams that came before them. And then we have a second path, and this is called the path of the fuqahāʼ. And historically, this is exemplified by the Hanafi school, may Allah have mercy upon them. And what they did was they said, okay, we have all this fiqh available to us already. We have all these rules and regulations available to us already. Let's take it and try to work backwards and see what the principles were that they applied to get to this fiqh. Okay, so they took the fiqh and they worked backwards to get to the principles. So we have one way of thinking, which is we get the principles and we derive the rules and regulations without really concerning ourselves too much with what's already there. And then we have the second way, which is the path of the fuqahāʼ, mainly the Hanafi school here, which is we have all these rules and regulations already. Let's try and figure out how they got to it in the first place. Let's work backwards. And you'll find that generally speaking, the mutakallimin in their usul are very close together. I.e. the Hanafi, the Shafi'i and the Malikis. In their usul are very close together. Even in their fiqh, they're very close together. The Hanafis are the school that stands out. I'm not being negative about the Hanafis here. It's just a historical reality. It's a school that stands out. Their method, their approach to Usul Al-Fiqh was different. Therefore, you find that their fiqh as well is very different from the other three schools. Do you have your hand up? Yeah.
The two, are they referred to as Ahlul Athar or Ahlul Rai?
Yeah, they're called, so Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i is another terminology for them, and that also has a link to creed as well. Okay. But yeah, Ahlul Hadith, if you like. Ahlul Hadith is the mutakallimin, and Ahlul Ra'i is the fuqahāʼ. Yeah.
Why would they call mutakallimin? How does it connect?
I think it's to do with the fact that I'm not too sure as to why they were called mutakallimin or Usul Al-Fiqh. I think it's to do with the fact that they use a scientific approach in their approach to usul. Is there any questions so far? Yeah.
Does Ahlul Ra'i have a bad connotation to it?
Yes, historically speaking, it doesn't. The term Ahlul Ra'i does have a negative connotation, historically speaking, and that's when you look at the works of the Ahlul Hadith. Generally, they refer to Ahlul Ra'i in a very negative way. Today, it doesn't have that negative connotation as it did in the past. In the past, it's a very contextual debate that was happening at that time that led even the Ahlul Ra'i to say negative things, or to view this term Ahlul Hadith as negative, and Ahlul Hadith to view the term Ahlul Ra'i as negative. But it's a very historical debate. It's not really existent anymore nowadays.
Okay, so you said the mutakallimin, they look to the tools and they didn't really look to the rulings.
Yeah.
So could it be that they will contradict the Sahaba?
It could be that they ended up with rulings that were different from the rulings of the Sahaba. But again, there were checks and balances in place to make sure that really rarely happened, if at all, because they're looking at like ijma and so on, other tools that they use as well to try to derive rules and regulations. So it wasn't just, blindly going in. They actually took ijma as well as a source.
So the four sources that you said, Quran, Sunnah, Arabic, and logic. So qiyas and ijma fall under?
Yeah, so I'm going to come on to that in a minute, inshallah. So what we're going to be studying here today, and in the next 9 or so lessons, is 4 general areas. The first one is the area of ahkam, or rules and regulations. And more specifically, al-hukm. What is a ruling? What is the essence, the nature of a ruling? Who has a rule? Who has the authority to make rules and regulations? Where does it come from? So we'll be talking about ahkam and the meanings of the different categories of ahkam: wājib, mustahab, haram, etc. We'll also be talking about the sources. Here we will be talking about the book, the Quran, and the Sunnah, and what's based on the book and the Sunnah, which is 2 main things: by agreement, ijma', consensus, and qiyas, analogy. So the book, the Sunnah, Ijma, Qiyas, this is it together. And we'll also cover very briefly Arabic language. We can't cover Arabic language in detail because we need to know Arabic language to cover Arabic language in detail. And so that's the second area. The third area we'll be covering is the methods of extracting law. So we talked about what rules and regulations are. We talked about the sources. We'll also talk about the methods of extracting law. And the fourth area we'll talk about is ijtihad and the mujtahid. Not anybody is allowed to derive rules and regulations. And definitely nobody sitting in this room can derive rules and regulations. And this course, it will not make the person who graduates from it, in inverted commas, somebody capable of passing rules and regulations. This course, it will make us appreciate what's involved in deriving rules and regulations. It won't make us people who are able to do that act. It's only the mujtahid scholar that is allowed to and can derive rules and regulations from the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Messenger ﷺ. And we'll talk about what a mujtahid scholar is and the qualifications required for a person to become a mujtahid, inshallah, as well. So that's the four areas we'll be talking about.